see if the camera will move. And let's see which microphone we've got using. I'm going to test this because I forgot to look before I started it. So just give me 1 second to test the mic. Let's see if it's going. All right, it sounds like we have, it's working, so that's good. All right, so I was hoping we'd have a bigger class today because today's lecture and the lecture that we'll have next week are the ones that, from a marketing student's perspective, are probably the most interesting that we'll have in this entire class. The beginning of the class, we talk a lot about philosophical ethics, and that's sort of an abstract area, and a lot of students don't really get it, and they don't really like it. I like it because I like thinking about those kinds of things. That's what I started out being interested in, was in philosophy and the law and whether or not you could prove the existence of God, and those kinds of arguments were really, really interesting to me. They're not interesting to most students because they're really, really hard, but this is really concrete and it involves stuff that you have familiarity with and that you see on the news and in the television and in advertising every single day. And for example, there are all kinds of advertisements every single time. And next time we'll talk about advertising and the ethics of that. But there are all kinds of advertising about, were you exposed to, for example, Tylenol in utero? There are now lawsuits, class action lawsuits that involve the children or parents of children who have children with autism who took Tylenol when they're, when they were pregnant with the child, and there's evidence to suggest that Tylenol now may have some impact on causing autism. Now, I think one of the things that you can look at in that's kind of interesting about these studies is that, first of all, because autism is a spectrum, like there's like severely autistic and there's not severely autistic, that like almost everybody has autism anymore. They're diagnosing almost everybody with it, to the extent that I'm not sure that it's particularly meaningful anymore. I'm not sure that the diagnosis is particularly meaningful, and that the condition hasn't swallowed up the entire population to the point that it's not only not meaningful, but it's also not helpful in treating patients. So, I mean, we can talk about that, and that's all part of the discussion that we'll have today in the next class on advertising for this kinds of stuff. So let's start out with a case study and let's talk about this. So I am sort of unusual in that I never wanted to have children. Most people do. And my wife, when I was married, also said that she didn't want to have children. And then when we got a divorce, she went and she's now had like 5 children. So apparently she just didn't want to have children with me, which I was sort of like offended by. Although then it's like, well, why should I be offended? Because I don't want to have children, right? I mean, I never wanted to have children. Yeah, it's just not something that's at all appealing to me because I'm inherently a selfish person. And I like toys. I like cars and boats and airplanes, and all of those things cost money. And if you want to have them, children interfere with that because you have to think about things like the kid needs, a new car seat, and you got to buy a minivan instead of a sports car or a pickup truck, or these kinds of issues that you face when you have kids. My brother, who is very capable of affording children because he makes an exceptionally large amount of money as a tax attorney for Goldman Sachs, always said that he wanted to have like 5 or 6 kids because we actually have 3 other siblings, but they didn't grow up with us. They were, my stepdad had a first marriage, and he was 14 years older than my mother. And so he had this family before he married He married my mom when I was like 2 years old, so he was pretty much the only father I knew. And then they had my brother. So there were these older kids that, would come to sort of Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners and stuff like that. But by the time my stepdad married my mom, they were already in high school. So they were beyond, living with us or anything like that. So my brother always wanted to have lots of kids because we grew up in a family where there was just basically two of us. And he always thought that would be great. And then he had one kid and realized how expensive that kid was going to be. And all of a sudden he changed his mind and didn't want to have any more kids. He just wanted to stick with the one. And his wife almost instantly got pregnant with their second kid. And so they're what are called Irish twins for a very short period of time. Each year they're the same age. They were born within the same 12-month period. So he had these two kids, and then he just absolutely stopped because he said, this is way too expensive to have these children. He makes a lot more money than I do. And if he thinks that 2 children are expensive, I certainly would think that 2 children are expensive because I have these expensive hobbies, right? But most people want to have kids. That's sort of human nature. Most people want to have children. And that's evidenced, I think, by the gay and lesbian movement. Once gays and lesbians were capable of adopting children, and the law changed as a result of a case called Lawrence and Gardner versus Texas and Obergefell versus Hodges, which legalized same-sex marriage. Once the law changed and these people who were in these kinds of relationships had the opportunity to have children, they started having children, right? I mean, they started adopting children, or they started having children via surrogacy, or through finding a sperm donor or whatever. I mean, this is sort of a natural thing. In the 1970s, the fertility movement medicine really took off with regard to these kinds of issues. So most people can not only want children, but they can also have children. The number of people who can't have children is a relatively small percentage of the population. But there are a significant small percentage of the population that can't have children, and they want to have children. Now, there are 2 types of infertility or fertility problems that you can have. As I understand it, I'm not a medical doctor, with regard to female infertility. One is they just can't conceive. For whatever reason, they don't get pregnant. A second type of problem that you can have, and I'm sure that the medical community would be horrified at my sort of simplification of this, but for our discussion purposes and for the discussion of the case and pharmaceutical industry purposes, the second type, which is what we'll focus on, are women who can get pregnant but have difficulty carrying a child to term. And in some of the studies that I've seen, this type of infertility can be even more devastating than women who just can't seem to get pregnant. Because you get your hopes up, and then what happens is you miscarry the child. So the pharmaceutical industry was testing out various drugs, and one of the drugs that they tested for something other than what it became marketed for, it showed promise in helping these women who miscarried actually carry children to term. And the product was called diethylstilbestrol, DES. And I'm probably slaughtering the chemical name for that. Again, I'm not a chemist or medical doctor, but the short form was DES. I think it's pronounced diethylstilbestrol, but it's one of those words that is enormously long and has 20 syllables in it. If you can do better at pronouncing it than I can, good luck. So they bring this product to market, and products go through safety testing, right? When you bring a drug to market, you have to go through the FDA. You can't just put something out there without going through clearances for things like this. And they went through all of these product tests. A lot of drugs, by the way, once they're released, they can be prescribed for things that are off of what they were originally approved for. So for example, one of the things that they have figured out that they now, and I think it's now FDA cleared for the second purpose, that you can prescribe Botox, which is botulism toxin, for. It was originally developed, so you take botulism toxin and you shoot it into people who have muscle spasms, certain types of genetic disorders or other conditions that may have been brought about by environmental factors that cause muscle spasms. Most of these probably are genetic, but so for example, there's a genetic disorder called dystonia, which causes involuntary contractions of muscles and things like that. I think that Diane Rehm, if any of you know who she is, had a form of dystonia that affected her vocal cords. One of my friends used to listen to the Diane Rehm show. She's on public radio, or she was, and he always referred to her as the smoker. And I'm like, she's not a smoker. I don't think she was ever a smoker, but she has dystonia, which causes involuntary contraction of her vocal cords. And so she talks like this. And they developed botulism toxin. They noticed that it paralyzes muscles. That's one of the ways. I mean, you can figure this out. Botulism poisoning, I guess, will paralyze the muscles and cause death if you have too much of it. But if you inject just small amounts of it, it can lessen the effects of these involuntary restrictions or flexing of the muscle. And dystonia, I believe, is one of the causes that they originally approved it for. They noticed that when they injected Botox into these areas, that what happened? Anybody know what it's now used for primarily?
It's like filler.
It's not a filler.
Well, it's not exactly a filler, but it's kind of used in the same place now.
It's used in the same place, but it's not a filler.
De-aging, get rid of wrinkles.
Yeah, it gets rid of wrinkles. You can both get a duck for that. So, because you're correct, it stops wrinkles. It's not a filler. The fillers are like collagen, type things. What this does is, particularly, and I've had a lot of Botox. It started when I was in my 20s. It stops the involuntary muscle contractions in your forehead, the furrowing of your brow. And so if you're not furrowing your brow, the wrinkles go away. So they noticed that, when they injected it into these places, that wrinkles go away. And so it's been used, off of the approval for other things. And I think it's now actually been approved for the treatment of wrinkles. So Botox is very effective for because crow's feet, a lot of people just frown naturally, and you develop these crow's feet, you can inject it right there. Now there's risks to this, right? What are the risks to injecting botulism poison right next to your eye? Well, it can spread, and that could be bad, or you could drop an eye where you can't see, and it looks like you've had a stroke. That actually happened to both my mother and I. We got Botox one time, and they just hit the wrong place, and for about 6 weeks, I looked like I had had a stroke because I had one eye that wouldn't open. But vanity it's a horrible thing. So DES is like this. I think they invented it for something else, but they noticed that women who were taking it were all of a sudden able to carry their children to term. So they started prescribing it. And of course, it had gone through this rigorous process to prove that it was, basically safe. For every drug, there will be interactions, and there will be people that will have negative effects as a result of taking that drug. What happened with DES was that it didn't affect the women who took the drug. It affected their offspring years after they had taken the drug. A small percentage of the offspring of these women who had ingested this drug in order to take children to term developed rare cancers. And it wasn't just all of the offspring. It was only a subset of the offspring, and it was only female offspring that developed these cancers. So if they had a male, I don't believe there were any cases of these unusual cancers. I think they had mostly to do with sort of female anatomical cancers that are specific to that subset. So it was not breast cancer, for example. Men can get breast cancer. It was things like rare forms of cervical cancer, as I recall, uterine cancers, things like that. So 20 years later, after they develop this drug and they use it, these children develop these rare cancers, and of course, some of them die. And what do you think they did in the United States? I mean, being Americans, what did they do?
Went after,
They what?
went after the company.
Went after the drug companies, right? They went after the drug companies and sued them. Is that fair? Is that fair?
What was the original purpose or prescription again?
Let's look. I'll look at what it was originally prescribed for. All right. It was originally developed for hormone therapy for menopause symptoms and estrogen deficiency, and to treat prostate cancer and breast cancer. It's rarely used now.
I think it'd be right.
You don't think it'd be what?
I don't think it'd be right to go after the drug company.
Why?
Because it's not. It would help with like carrying a child to term, but that's not the specific, it's not really what it was intended for. It's not what it was developed as. Therefore, I think it's unfair to use it essentially off prescription and then to go back 20 years later and be like, well, this didn't work for my specific situation, so I want $1 million.
Okay. I'm not sure. I mean, I guess what your argument is that you can get a duck, by the way. It's not that you should sue the drug manufacturer in that instance. Maybe what you're suggesting, I think, if I understand your argument, is that you should sue the doctor who uses it off of.
Yeah, maybe that.
You should sue the doctor for that.
Potentially that, or
Okay.
some sort of like regulation for not, but.
So maybe we should say that when drugs are approved for a certain use, they shouldn't be used unless they have FDA clearance for these other purposes.
That or
like
don't
that,
go
like-
back and complain about it.
Or if you do, you've assumed the risk.
Yeah, is kind of the way I would look
Okay.
at it, I think.
This case is really hard because the women who are suing are basically saying, I mean, like, if it's like, if this drug works, now, according to a lot of the literature on what I've read, it was used for those with a history of recurrent miscarriages. There was a lot of evidence to suggest afterwards that it didn't actually work very effectively for that. I don't know how you prove that, because if people were having recurrent miscarriages before and then they took the drug and they didn't have them after, I mean, this is one of the reasons that medicine is not a perfect science. We can't just randomly assign people to groups and say, we're going to give you this drug. One of my friends wants to do this. He has this argument, and he fundamentally doesn't understand like science. And it drives me crazy because he's a somewhat educated person. He has a bachelor's degree, And a bachelor's degree is not really about, understanding the intricacies of science, although you should have had some exposure to the scientific method. So this is what my friend wants to do. He wants to propose that, and I mean, there's just all kinds of ethical issues with this proposal. His proposal is, when I've talked to him, is that what we should do is we should test drugs on prisoners. We should just randomly give prisoners these drugs and see what happens. And my problem with that is that, okay, let's start with, there's just a huge ethical issue with that, right? We're just gonna do these experiments on people, whether they like it or not. And it's like, I'm just like horrified from an ethical standpoint by his thinking there. And I've like had this discussion with him, and he's like, well, they've done something wrong, they deserve it. Oh, like I'm just like, no. But even beyond that, even if you could get beyond the ethics of that situation, there's another problem, which is that the prison population is not particularly representative of the population as a whole, right? I mean, it's just not. And so you're not getting a truly random sample of, if you wanted to truly random, you would just have a lottery and you'd call people in and say, you're part of this experiment that we're doing. We're going to draw 250 people out of the 300 million people that live in the United States for this study. And half of them are going to get a placebo and half of them are going to get this, that's the way and so there are not perfectly fitting model. It's not like we can do these things in an absolutely controlled environment. But what you're arguing when you're these women that are suing the drug manufacturer is it would really be better if I had never been born. Isn't it? Isn't that the argument? It would really be better if I had just never been born. And if you live 20 years, 25 years or whatever, and isn't some life better than never having been born? That's what you're basically arguing. When you see the drug manufacturer, you're saying like you should never have given this drug, or it should never have been brought to market, and I should never have been born. That to me seems to be an exceedingly ethically tenuous position to take. I'm going to hold you responsible for something that basically means that my argument is I should never have been brought into this world. Most people want to live, right? I mean, most people cling to life. This is exemplified by a book called Candide, in which Voltaire and his main character Candide engage in this, debate about who has the worst life among he and his beloved Cunegonde, which is his sort of lover who he is prevented from seeing for years on end, and then they finally reunite and they meet along the way, this old woman, and they start talking about the trials and tribulations of their life and who's had the worst life. And the old woman says, well, no one's had a worse life than I have. It turns out that this old woman who is ugly and sort of horrible and bitchy was at one time the daughter of a pope. Now, popes are not supposed to have daughters, right? They're supposed to be celibate, but they did in the past. They had daughters. So she's the daughter of a pope, and she was supposed to be married to a prince. She was engaged to a prince. And on the way to getting married to the prince, she gets captured by pirates. And they get shipwrecked, and in order to survive, they cut off half of her butt and eat it. So she's left with, one butt cheek, and she's then sold into slavery and goes through all of these things. And she says, but in spite of everything that I've been through, I went on loving life. In spite of the misery and suffering that I've had, I went on loving life. And I've only known, she says, a handful of people that have taken their own lives. She lists something like 5. One of them is a German professor named Robeck. And in fact, this is a reality. I mean, it's a novel or an anti-novel, but there was a German professor named Robeck who did write a thing about suicide and then committed suicide. Most people love life. So your argument ensuing is like, I should never have gotten life. Doesn't that seem to be an enormously ethically tenuous position? I think it does. Let's take a clearer example of one of the problems with this sort of argument. And it's a case in tort called the Fallsgraf case. Mrs. Fallsgraf is standing on a platform of a railroad station, waiting for a train, and a man carrying a package is running to catch a train, and he jumps as the train is leaving the platform onto the train that he's supposed to catch, and an usher sort of steadies him and pushes him onto the train so that he doesn't fall onto the tracks, and he drops the package that he's carrying. It turns out the package has explosives in it, and the explosives go off when they hit the tracks. The reverberation from the explosives causes some scales at the other end of the platform where Mrs. Fallsgraf is standing to fall and hit her in the head. Who does she sue?
No one,
Huh?
no one,
No one?
yeah, well, she could sue.
Who do you think she sues? The case is styled Fallsgraf versus, I think it's the Long Island Railroad. She sues the railroad. Why?
They got more money.
They got more money, right? Yeah, I mean, it's just, you look around for who has the deepest pockets, and that's who I'm gonna sue, right? The one that is most likely to be able to pay, right? So these kinds of issues involve product safety. We're going to talk about pricing issues and ethics, and then of course, marketing theory, right? So this is the intersection between marketing theory. Now, the reason that we have to sort of go back to marketing theory and do a refresher on this is because a lot of human history and development of products and the way we view them ethically is intimately correlated to these sort of marketing theories that we held. Marketing theories correspond to epochs in history, right? And we've talked about this before, I think. So just as sort of a refresher, and you should have had this in your principles of marketing class years and years and years ago. There are various theories about the way companies should bring products to market. The oldest theory, and the one that operated for most of human history until roughly the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, was the production theory. The production theory can be summed up as, if you build it, they will come. If you have something that's at all useful, people will buy it. And for most of human history, this was true because products were scarce. They were made in small batches. There wasn't, sophisticated, for most of human history, manufacturing techniques. And so, there was some specialization. People specialized, but they didn't have mass production the way we know it today, where we get computers and chairs and things like that. Things were built by hand and people could inspect the goods. So the production theory, if you have something to sell, people will buy it if it's at all useful because they need it, right? Now, for most of that human history, and we don't know when the first civilizations formed, but we have echoes of these in various texts, that when these first civilizations formed, people started to specialize. But even with that specialization, for most of human history, people could look at goods and they could determine whether or not they were good or not, right? I mean, if you go back in time, even to the founding of the state of Oklahoma, we had a land run. We were settled. The unassigned lands were settled by land runs, the first of which occurred on April 22nd, 1889. And the vast majority of people who ran in that land run arrived by horse, right? They lined up on the border. And I mean, this is not that long ago, right? 1889, I mean, it's over 100 years ago, but I mean, when I moved to Guthrie in 1986, there were still people whose parents had come in the land run, I mean, that were alive. Their parents had arrived, that was not unusual. So you got this horse, that's the basic mode of transportation for a lot of people, prior to the Industrial Revolution and the Ford Motor Company. And people could sort of inspect the horse, right? I mean, you could go out and you could look and see whether or not the horse was sway back, whether or not the joints were swollen. You could lift up the feet and tell whether or not it had thrush, these kinds of things, and you could inspect the horse. With the beginning of the sales era, which starts in the Industrial Revolution, and we start seeing mass production and advanced specialization of goods, it becomes harder and harder. Although, when the first automobiles came out, people could inspect them. Although I will tell you that when they built the first railroads in Great Britain, there was a theory at the time that women shouldn't ride on the railroads because the speed of the transportation might cause them to have miscarriages and things like that. That's what they thought. But, still the Ford Model T was, fairly basic. You could inspect it and tell whether or not it was, safe, I guess, with some basic knowledge. It becomes more difficult once we get past that. And then when we get into, the highly technical, sophisticated world that we're in, and the marketing era, where we are able to really pinpoint what people want and produce it with great amounts of sophistication, it becomes even more tenuous to determine whether or not something's dangerous. Is that device that you all have right there that you're playing on, is it inherently dangerous? I think maybe it is. One of the things that's happened as a result of these devices being readily available is the attention span of the average person has, I mean, one of the reasons that nobody's in this, there are something like 30 people enrolled in this class. And how many of them actually show up? Not a lot. Because maybe I'm broadcasting it and they figure, but they can't get points if they're not showing up. I doubt they actually watch the video afterwards. Well, I guess some do. It looks like there are some replays of my videos, but it's not like I have a booming YouTube channel that I'm monetizing and making huge amounts of money on. It's not like Marketing Professor is all of that, sexy of a topic that people are just, wanting to watch it. I mean, they're watching cute cat videos. I think that's the number one most Googled YouTube videos, like cute cat or cute animal videos, these clips that people have. That may be inherently dangerous. It has trained us to think in very short segments of time, because if we get bored, We just click the button and switch the focus, right? So all of these issues come into play when we think about the ethics of these things. So in terms of product safety, we've also seen an evolution, just like we've seen an evolution in marketing theory, we've seen an evolution in the law. And again, the law is not necessarily the moral minimum, but the law is an important factor to consider. So for most of human history, as people were able to evaluate the horse and basic automobiles, I mean, do you know whether or not your car is safe now? Not really. I mean, do you have some idea? You can read Consumer Reports. They'll tell you that, you know, like Volvo's a very safe car, I guess. Subaru, I mean, Subaru has all of these ads out about they show you all of these crashes of Subaru vehicles. And then they're like, they lived, you know, I mean, so apparently Subaru thinks at least they're promoting the idea that they're a very safe car. They have to promote the idea that they're a very safe car, I guess, because they're, you know, a horribly unattractive car. I mean, there's just nothing, I mean, they're kind of ugly and they're boring. They even have ugly colors. You know, they're just ugly colors. And, you know, this is not a value judgment. But if you Google, one of my students told me this years ago, came up with this. If you Google lesbian car, that's what comes up. It's the first thing that comes up is Subaru. Yeah, so I mean, they're not, you know, I mean, it's not a Porsche. They're not selling speed or I mean, they're just not even pretty cars. And they're not even interesting looking cars. They're just sort of boring and utilitarian. So we went from this idea of caveat emptor, which meant buyer beware. And we've grown since then on these issues. So we started out with buyer beware, and Cher talks about this in her song Gypsies, Tramps, and Thieves, which is an old song that probably most of you have never heard about. But in the lyrics to that, she talks about how her father makes money. They're gypsies and they travel from town to town, and you know, we dance for the people in the town, and Daddy would sell a couple of bottles of Dr. Good. There were these people that traveled around the country, you know, they claimed to be pharmacists in the past, and they would sell bottles of all kinds of things that were supposed to cure everything from, you know, baldness to blindness, and most of them were made out of things like mercury and caused death, or you know, and the idea was in the past, well, like, you know, if you believe this, if you're stupid enough to buy that, well, then you get what you paid for. And again, when times were simpler and we could evaluate the horse and we could evaluate the Model T, we could go out there and we could kick the tires and we could sort of, you know, I mean, if the car is leaking oil all over the ground, you probably know that there's something wrong with it, that maybe you need to look elsewhere. It's hard to tell that anymore, right? I mean, with modern cars. Lots of cars, for example, I mean, if you looked at the transmission and stuff like that, you can't tell whether or not I mean, in the past, again, going back to when I was a child, you know, you could look at transmissions and they might leak fluid and say, wow, that transmission needs to be rebuilt. There's something wrong. A lot of them are now enclosed systems where they don't leak anything. They're sealed systems. So you can't really evaluate them anymore. It's impossible. So we move from this theory in the law of caveat emptor, which is let the buyer beware, to an idea of negligence. Now, what ethical theory could we use to support caveat emptor? So the basic ethical theories that we have are duty ethics, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, and sort of a moral minimum, right? What theory could we use to support caveat emptor?
Duty ethics?
Yeah, I guess you could use duty to support caveat emptor. The idea that you as a consumer, have a duty to inform yourself about the products that you're buying. And at the law, we think that. How many of you have actually read the user agreements for these devices that you're using? When you turned the device on, there was probably, and you started the OS, because these are all three of you have Apples, right? They're all MacBooks? Is that a MacBook?
No, this one's Windows.
Oh, you've actually got a Windows box there. So you got these MacBooks, these, there was a user, did you read it? No. Why not?
It's long as crap. Yeah, they make.
Shouldn't you know what's in, could you be harmed by that?
I mean, you could, but I would just sue Apple then.
Shouldn't you take some responsibility? Like, how could you be harmed by not reading that Windows user agreement? And then I'm gonna guess that not only, since you didn't read the Windows when you started the box up, I'm gonna guess you downloaded a whole lot of apps that all had in-user agreements, and you didn't read any of those either, right?
I didn't read this one, but I didn't download any apps.
Didn't download it, there's nothing on that box?
There's already on stuff on it that I needed. I didn't download anything.
Really? You don't have a web browser?
I mean, it was already on there when I opened it.
Did you read the end user agreement for the web browser? What could happen to you from not reading that end user agreement? What do you think they're doing? They're using your data, right?
Yeah, but they use your data for everything.
Isn't that dangerous?
Oh yeah, it is dangerous, but I mean, I don't know what we can do about it.
I don't know. So, caveat emptor, yeah, you have a duty. You have a duty to inform yourself. Now, people don't do that. They don't do it. People do you read the package insert on the drugs that you're taking? No, probably not. So we move from that to a theory of negligence. Now, negligence is clearly based on duty, right? We could also maybe make a caveat emptor argument using utilitarian theory, in that we could say the free hand of the market will ultimately decide which products survive and which products fail. Now, a lot of people may die, and your data may be used in lots of ways that are detrimental to you, right? Marketers can use your data to start selling you products that you didn't even know you needed. But hey, if we didn't like that, we could change it. We would stop using it. So we could use a utilitarian theory to support caveat emptor, in that ultimately, like, what happens is the best products in the market rise to the top and they continue to go on, and aren't we all happier by that? And yeah, some people experience some pain maybe as a result of taking these products, but overall, we get better products, and those people who experienced bad products, well, by and large, on the whole, society has moved on, we're better for it. That doesn't work real well once you start getting really advanced, if it's advanced societies. And once we start moving off the farm and into town. So there's a whole series of cases that are called the railroad turntable cases. And this involves not products that were sold to the person who's injured, but to bystanders of products, right? So once we start moving beyond the horse, and we can all see what the danger is with the horse, right? If you grow up on a farm, you know that you don't walk directly behind the horse. Now people do it all the time. There's safe ways of doing this, because when you're saddling a horse, it's kind of pain to walk all the way around the horse. So you learn how to do this safely. I was a wrangler when I was younger for a trail riding company in northern New Mexico that took tourists up into the mountains. You learn how to do this safely, right? But people sort of figure this out pretty quickly. Like you get kicked and you break your leg and you don't walk behind the horse anymore, right? And you don't leave your baby behind the horse because horses kick. So you figure this out pretty quickly, but then we start moving into communities, we start getting cars, things get more urban. And now we have products that are sold that are harming us that are not even sold to us. And that's what happens in these railroad turntables. You can still see remnants of these turntables in San Francisco. You go to San Francisco and they have these streetcars, and when the streetcar comes to the end of the line, they have this turntable that the person can get out. They'll insert a key into the street and they'll put the thing and it'll turn on this turntable and the trolley will go off down another path. In the olden times, trains went one direction, they went forward. When they got to the end of the line, you didn't just dump the train, you put them on a turntable and you turned them around and sent them off down another track, right? Well, these turntables become attractive to children who are playing, these urban areas build up around railroads because that's where the goods come in, that's where jobs are. These people have kids, the kids go outside, they play, they get on the turntables and what do? Well, they injure their limbs, they cut off fingers, things like that. And so the law changes with regard to this idea of, let the buyer beware, or, trespassers are owed no duty. That was the thing with the turntables, was that, if you walk on somebody's land, you're owed no duty. Trespasser beware. And all of a sudden the law begins to say, this is really harsh. You have these injuries on these children and there's this attractive thing, and it develops the attractive nuisance doctrine. And so we get this idea of negligence developing in the law. We go from trespassers are owed no duty, consumers are owed no duty, it's caveat emptor, to, well, maybe you have a duty, right? So if you have this inherently dangerous thing, you may have a duty to protect people from it. So we start with this idea of negligence. So then we have a duty, you have a breach of the duty. That breach of the duty causes injury. And that injury has to be both proximate cause which is legal causation and cause in fact. So this is the Fallscraft case that I talked about earlier. With regard to negligence, the person pushes the guy and so she sues the railroad, right? Because the railroad has deeper pockets and she uses a but-for test, but for the fact that the railroad employee pushed this guy onto the train, I wouldn't be injured. Because his act caused the guy to stumble, drop the package, and ultimately injure me. And the court says, that's too attenuated. That's not reasonably foreseeable. That's a freak accident. No one would think that somebody pushing somebody onto a train would cause scales at the other end of the platform to fall and hit you in the head. Now let's apply this to the diethylstilbestrol case. Using a theory of negligence, which is duty-based. So we're going to start saying you have these duties. If you manufacture goods, you have a duty to take a reasonable amount of care to make sure that people aren't injured. It's easy to do with these turntables, right? You can lock them up. That's what they do. They put a lock on them. You have to have this key to turn it. Easy to do. But Fallscraft says, look, this is not reasonably foreseeable, this idea of these scales hitting you in the head. Is it reasonably foreseeable to think that the children of women who took a drug 30 years prior would become ill from the effects of, no. I don't think that's reasonable. Now, in hindsight, we can see this, right? There are studies, so one of the big studies in economics that everybody hates was a study on abortion done by Stephen Levitt, who's an economist at the University of Chicago. And he and this other author start looking at abortion because this is a natural experiment in the economy. Prior to 1973, children born were not exposed to abortion because the abortion laws were fairly restrictive except for a handful of states. After 1973, you have this break. And so they look at the crime rate 20 years after 1973. And guess what happens to the crime rate? When they run the analysis, abortion accounts for about 50% of the decrease in the crime rate. Now, further studies along with that, so going along with this idea of Tylenol causes, and I don't know that this is true, but there are now these lawsuits popping up that say Tylenol causes autism spectrum disorder because it crosses the placenta and affects the fetus in utero. There are now people that are looking at the effects of stress. Even children that are born, that are not aborted, but are unwanted, are exposed, they think, in some of these studies, to more of the stress hormone, cortisol, while their mothers are pregnant than children who are not. And this may have an impact, right? So we now know that all these things cross the placenta and can have an impact on children, right? This is where, from an ethics standpoint, it gets really tenuous because we go from negligence. So we went from caveat emptor, which we can support using two theories, basically duty. We can say, look, you have a duty to inform yourself. And utilitarianism, which is, look, products that are bad, people will come to recognize they're bad and they'll stop using them. And we'll get better products as a result. To a theory of duty, purely duty, negligence, which is we're now going to ascribe duties to manufacturers of products. And I think we can all understand these. We can all understand that if you have this dangerous product and you sell it to somebody and they put it on their land and these children are attracted to it, that you have a duty to take reasonable precaution to lock that up. Where has this idea of negligence gone from just railroad turntables? Well, it's now gone into all kinds of other things, like swimming pools. If you have a swimming pool and you live in town, you're going to have a fence around the swimming pool. If you don't, most cities are going to find you liable when some kid drowns in your pool, because that's an attractive nuisance. And it's easy for you to keep people out, right? How much you have to keep them out is a, an interesting question. How much of a fence do you have to have? In Florida, they have these totally enclosed pools on their lanai, they're completely enclosed. How much protection do you have to have? Then we move beyond that to strict products liability. Now, what this says is that even if you took, so with the DES, they did all of these tests and nobody got cancer. It seemed safe. And so we were reasonably prudent in bringing this product to market. And yet, we're going to hold the drug company liable. Why are we going to do that? Well, this is purely a utilitarian theory, right? You can use two theories to support caveat emptor. You can use duties to support negligence. Strict products liability is purely utilitarian. What you're saying in strict products liability is it doesn't matter how safe you make your product. If somebody's injured by it, you manufacturer are going to be liable for that injury. Now, this seems horribly unfair, doesn't it? Doesn't that seem unfair to you?
Yeah.
Absolutely unfair. Let's take the case of Willie Searcy. Willie Searcy is riding in his stepfather's Ford F-150, which is the most popular pickup truck on the market for something like 20 years running. It has been the #1 selling pickup in America for 20. I think it still is. Although Dodge is making a big cut into that market. But the Ford F-150 has been for years and years and years the most popular pickup truck. Now, you know, the Japanese firms are starting to make an impact on that. It used to be that you couldn't get a Japanese truck that was really that big. They've now come out with the Tundra, and it's, you know, I mean, but Ford is still an enormously popular pickup truck. Searcy is riding in the front seat of his stepfather's Ford F-150, and his dad tells him, her stepfather tells him to pick up some trash that he dropped on the floor in front of him. And so he bends forward to pick up the item that he's been told to pick up. And at that exact moment, as he's going forward, his father slams into the back of another vehicle. And Searcy is thrown into the windshield of the F-150, breaks his neck, and becomes a quadriplegic who is going to need full-time care for the rest of his life. It turns out he was wearing a seatbelt, that the reason that this happens is that there is a defect, a design defect in the tension regulator of the shoulder harness on that particular model of F-150. What happens? You all know what happens when you pull on the shoulder harness quickly. It engages a lock on it and it restrains you, right? But if you are naturally going forward at the time that you have impact, if you're not set back and it doesn't feel a sudden jolt and you're already putting pressure on the tension regulator, it doesn't catch. I mean, this is a freak accident. How many times is this going to happen? Willie Searcy's parents, of course, sue Ford. It's going to take millions of dollars to keep this kid alive. He is on a ventilator, which has to be changed and serviced every 8 hours or more, maybe every 6 hours. A family who needs to go to work can't be there to do that all the time. So they had this patchwork of caregivers that were helping them out while they sued Ford. Ford told, now this is horrible, like this is horrible facts. Ford told Searcy's lawyers, if you can't come up with a figure that we find acceptable, we will continue to appeal and drag this case out until the kid dies. And that's exactly what happened. Searcy's parents had put together this hodgepodge of caregivers, and they know exactly when their son died. At some point, that hodgepodge and system of caregivers failed. One of the people who was hired to come in and take care of him was working on his ventilator when she got a call and her shift ended. and she simply forgot to return on the ventilator. And Cersei died. Horrible facts. And Ford seems to be a horrible actor in this case. But if we think about it, beyond the pure emotion of this, from a strict products liability standpoint, what are we saying? This is a freak accident. Is it possible to make a car that is absolutely safe, that will save people in every single instance? No. I mean, we've gotten a lot better over time. When I was a kid, seat belts in the back seats of cars were just lap belts. And if you were involved in an accident above anything over about 15 miles an hour, that lap belt could cut you in half and kill you or cause internal bleeding because the top part of your body was still flung forward violently, which is why we now have shoulder harnesses. It's why we now have airbags in these. But those are subject to failure as well. The first airbags were great if you were me. Was at the time, statistically, I'm now slightly taller than, I'm 5'11", I'm slightly taller than the average American male. It was made for the average American male. I was made for me. When they came out, I was 5'11" and I weighed something like 145 pounds. That's who they were made for. If you were short, a woman, they could just pop your little head off. When that airbag came out. You're still going to get pretty banged up and bruised with the airbags, but they're not going to take your head off anymore. If we take away the emotion from the Cersei case, we're still left with ethically problematic rationale. I think all of us mourn for that family. But ultimately, what we're saying is that it doesn't matter that Ford, this is a freak thing. You can't manufacture a car that is completely 100% safe. Just not possible. As long as humans are driving it, there's going to be a potential for death. And what you're saying by strict products liability is purely utilitarian. Who's in the better position to pay? It's Ford. Who's in the better position to take care of that kid and his family for the rest of his life? It's Ford. Purely utilitarian. Now, what does that mean for the rest of us? Almost everything else. Now, we're going through a period of inflation right now, and things are getting more expensive, but almost everything else, over time, by and large, on the whole, gets cheaper. I was one of the first people to have a laptop when I was an undergraduate. They were enormously expensive. This was in the early 1990s. And my mother bought me a laptop that I took to class. And everybody was it was enormous. It weighed something like 12 pounds. It had a tiny little green screen. It was basically just a word processor. That was about all you could do on it. And it cost in the 1990s something like close to $2,000. I don't even think your MacBook cost $2,000, does it?
Yeah.
It did cost $2,000.
22.
I mean, that was, in the 90s, that was an astronomical amount of money to pay for something. You can now get a computer that has far more computing power than that one ever had for under $500. You can get a Windows box, a decent Windows box, not a gamer's unit or, anything like that, for far less than that. Clothing, by and large, on the whole, has gotten cheaper. What's gotten more expensive? Cars. Why have cars gotten more expensive? Because of cases like Cersei versus Ford. Because the product liability is so great that it's the one thing that hasn't come down in price. It's continued to go up and up and up because of strict products liability. So who actually is bearing the cost of this? It's actually not Ford. They're passing on these costs of these lawsuits to us, to everyone. We're all paying a little bit of the price of the Cersei lawsuit and others like that. Now, maybe if you do the calculus on this, overall, by and large, on the whole, from a utilitarian perspective, that's okay. But it seems inherently unfair. We take these risks all the time, and we say that that's just the price of being involved in an advanced civilization. People get hit by cars all the time. And unless you're doing something like driving under the influence or texting, we don't send you to jail for that. We could make the world a lot safer if we had strict liability with regard to car accidents and they've tried to do this with regard to, you see these signs that say, avoid a $10,000 fine, don't hit our workers in a work zone. Be aware. That's pretty chintzy in and of itself if you think about it. A $10,000 fine for hitting somebody? That's what they think a highway worker's life is worth? But we just accept that as the cost of living in the postmodern world, right? But it's purely utilitarian. What about pricing these products? We generally live in a free market, and so we have this idea that the market should decide what prices are. But we have some restraints on this. What are those restraints? Well, we avoid monopolistic pricing except in certain situations. We do allow for monopolies in certain situations. If you live in Edmond, for example, who provides your electric? Edmond Electric, not OG&E. Now, ultimately, OG&E provides it because they're the ones who sell it to Edmond, but you have to buy it from Edmond Electric. Now, what does that mean, and why is monopolistic pricing bad? Well, I can tell you, what does it mean that OG&E is my provider because I live in Guthrie? Well, do they really care about providing wonderful service if they have a monopoly?
They don't want to pay for anything, so like.
Yeah, they really don't. Now, they are pretty good, I must say, about getting things out in a storm. Now, it's maybe going to change because with the advent of really advanced solar, people are now able to, basically put solar on and avoid the OG&E costs.
Yeah,
Right? So they're now getting some competition.
My dad just got solar. I actually work for a solar company, so like we actually partner up with OG&E, and like you go solar right now, your pay will be the same for 25 years.
Right.
It won't be changing at all.
And you can reduce your monthly variance that you have in Oklahoma in the summertime when people, I have an old house in Guthrie, it's a bed and breakfast, it's 8,000 square feet, and our electric bill is about $1,000 a month in the summer for air conditioning. We also, even though we're capitalistic, or we are a mixed economy, we don't allow for price fixing where you collude in pricing, right? Now this happens all the time and it's difficult to prove, but we say, there are some things about fairness that we don't allow you to have. Price gouging is another one that there are lots of regulatory laws against, where you can't sell plywood for hundreds of dollars a sheet the minute you know that the hurricane is coming in Florida. or after the tornado in Oklahoma. One that's more subtle is predatory pricing. Now, this one has led to huge ethical failures in the home mortgage industry, where loan companies went in and sold people in the mid-2000s, and it's happened again because we are a society that has amnesia with regard to these things. They would sell people these low-interest loans that may be adjustable rate. And the idea was that you would refinance the mortgage, or you'd be able to get out of it easily because home prices were rising. And then the bubble fell out, and it affected not only the housing market, but all these others, because the finance companies were selling these as AAA rated bonds. They were called collateralized debt obligations. And they were lumping all of these together. And the idea was that if you had enough really good mortgages, along with these sort of junk mortgages that were being sold, that by and large, on the whole, the product would be actuarially sound. And it turns out they weren't, right? And it led to a collapse. There have been several movies about this, and other issues, with regard to the stock market. One that's really, really good that you should watch is called Margin Call, if you're interested in that. It's with Zachary Quinto, plays a financial analyst who sort of discovers this problem in the debts of an organization and the products that they have. It's a much more difficult one to deal with because it is far more subtle and complex and nuanced. One of the things that we could argue from a utilitarian perspective, for example, about the subprime mortgage industry is that it allowed people who never would have had a shot at buying a home. Historically speaking, if you wanted to buy a home, it was regulated by two of the big federal corporations called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which required full documentation of a loan. So you used to have to put something like 10% down on your home, which meant that if you had, a $100,000 home, you were going to have to put 10% down. And a lot of people are not good savers, so that eliminated a lot of people right off the bat. And I think in the 80s, it may have even been more. It may have been 20%. You had to put 20% down on the home and then, finance it for 30 years. And your banker would do what was called fully documenting the loan. They would go and ask your employer, what's your likelihood of continued employment at this job? You had to provide pay stubs. After Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae sort of deregulated and collapsed, they were allowing people to just get loans on stated income. You could lie and just say whatever you wanted. Now, from a utilitarian perspective, again, what we could say is that ultimately a lot of people got homes and maybe they were happier, and the vast majority of people didn't actually default. It was just that enough of them did that it created a financial crisis in these products that were being sold. So, these are enormously complex issues, and product pricing and product development are some of the ones that I think are the most interesting ones that we deal with in this course. Context is obviously relevant in these. These are highly factually driven cases that we have to think about in terms of long-term impacts that they will have. And it also highlights the integrative nature of marketing, how all of these things that we've been talking about come together and impact. How is it that predatory pricing in home mortgages impacted employees? Well, lots of companies went broke that were buying these kinds of products and were engaged in trading of these kinds of products that ultimately affected their employees and their bottom line. So we have to think about the triple bottom line, which is planet, people, and profits. Next time, we'll talk about advertising in place in the marketing mix. All right? Thanks. If you got ducks, come see me. I will stop the video.